Thanks very much, Amanda, for that great introduction. And I'm really pleased to be here tonight and to be, in my own small way, a part of this larger Reimagining Columbus project, which I think is really amazing and exemplary. And I hope other places, cities around the United States will learn from it and be able to, do their own similar kind of work. And I am really interested in the informal conversation that we can have after my talk in the Q&A. So I love to do that, and I love to to dialogue with you in the audience. So we will have an opportunity for that kind of informal conversation. But I do have a script. So I'm apologizing in advance. I do have a script, because if I didn't have a script, we would probably be here until nightfall. And so this will keep me on track, and will keep things running along a little bit more smoothly and efficiently. Okay, with that said, I'd like to start tonight by talking about an ephemeral monument. So an ephemeral monument is a monument that is not built to last. It sounds like a contradiction in terms, because traditionally the whole point of the public monument is to be imperishable, to make a statement for all time, forever. But since traditional monuments like your Columbus statue and others have come under increasing scrutiny and challenge, there has been a lot more discussion in recent years about making temporary monuments instead. Like traditional monuments, they are works of art erected in public space that tell stories about the past. But unlike traditional monuments, they are intended to come down, like a museum exhibition or a performance or a festivity. Last summer, in 2023, the National Mall in Washington, D.C., perhaps one of the most iconic spaces in the world, saw its first exhibition ever of temporary monuments. Been in the works. This project had been in the works for over a decade, and finally came to fruition, partly with the help of the Mellon Foundation, which funded it, just as it's funding Reimagining Columbus. And it was curated by the nonprofit organization Monument Lab, for which I serve now as a board member. The curators asked 6 artists to respond to the question, what stories remain untold on the National Mall? So here is, I can see this one. All right. Here is, here's just one of the 6 installations that went up for exactly 1 month at the end of the summer of 2023. It's called The Soil You See, by the artist Wendy Redstar, an enrolled member of the Crow, or now called Apsalohka Nation. So move. This work commemorated 50 Crow chiefs who had come to Washington, D.C. over the course of the 19th century to sign treaties with the United States government, many of which gave away large amounts of their land. Had this been proposed as a permanent monument in Washington, it would have required an act of Congress to authorize it and approval by several regulatory agencies, none of which would have happened. The material alone, the glass that it is made out of, this is a glass panel in the shape of a thumbprint that is set into a boulder, that the glass would probably not have been allowed for security reasons, much less the subject matter and its provocative placement in dialogue with the monument to the signers of the Declaration of Independence. If you've been to the site, it's in Constitution Gardens, which is where the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is, and where this rather little known, actually, memorial to the signers of the Declaration of Independence is located. It's a kind of counter monument to that existing monument. While the idea of the ephemeral monument seems new and very much about our own current situation, the idea is actually not new, like so many things that's been done before. And what I'd like to talk about for a while now is an ephemeral monument that was made more than 200 years ago. In the first decade of the United States' existence, it was erected to honor Christopher Columbus, the man who was said to have discovered the continent where Wendy Red Star's ancestors had been living and building communities long before Columbus was even ever born. The year this temporary monument was built was 1792, the 300th anniversary of Columbus's landing in the so-called New World. This was well before Italian Americans adopted him as their heroic symbol and made him the third most common individual commemorated in monumental form in the United States. You can go to the next one and one more. He's the third most commemorated individual in monuments after Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. This is from a national monument audit that was done by Monument Lab, again, funded by the Mellon Foundation. So long before the proliferation of Columbus statues erected by Italian-American organizations, largely in the 20th century, Christopher Columbus had a highly important role in the Anglo-American imagination and in the founding ideology of this nation. And that's what I want to focus my remarks on tonight. So, on October 12th, 1792, a patriotic organization of New Yorkers called the Tammany Society celebrated what is generally believed to be the first Columbus Day festival in the history of the world. The Tammany Society was a group of white tradesmen and middle-class entrepreneurs who were dedicated to carrying forward the egalitarian spirit of the American Revolution. Their event took place at night on the old Merchants Exchange building on the lower tip of Manhattan. This is what it looked like then. Obviously, it doesn't look like that anymore. This was a long time ago. The festivities featured an oration on Christopher Columbus and his achievements, a patriotic ode, numerous toasts, and even songs, but the highlight of the show was the unveiling of a 14-foot-high illuminated obelisk honoring Columbus, probably on the grounds outside this building. The obelisk was not only temporary, but it was portable and reusable as well. So it would be stored and then brought out again and illuminated again on special occasions. So, for example, just a few weeks after October 12th, 1792, the Tammany Society brought it out in December of 1792. They brought it out again to celebrate the downfall of the French monarchy. Unfortunately, there is no surviving image of it, but descriptions of this technological marvel filled the pages of newspapers from Baltimore to Boston. So I have to confess that before researching and writing this talk, I had no idea what an illuminated obelisk was in the late 18th century. In more recent times, obelisks have sometimes been illuminated from the outside with video projections. You can go to the next one. So this is a remarkable example by the artist Krzysztof Wodiszko, who is kind of a brilliant practitioner of temporary monuments. And it took place on 3 successive nights in 1998 at the Bunker Hill Obelisk, which is a major Revolutionary War memorial in Boston's neighborhood of Charlestown. And Wodiczko recorded testimonies of mothers whose sons had been murdered in the neighborhood surrounding the monument in the 1990s, 80s, and 90s, and who had chosen to break the code of silence that existed there at that time about these murders. Then he projected their testimonies onto the granite face of the obelisk at night, so that for a brief time the obelisk literally spoke the stories, the stories of these mothers and family members who had lost their sons. The Columbus obelisk of 1792 was illuminated from the inside, not from the outside. This type of temporary monument was actually well known in early America, and you can go to the next slide. And it was occasionally made for public celebrations, important public celebrations. This is an example of one made in Boston for the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766. It was an obelisk made out of wood, painted to look like stone, and decorated with transparencies that were fitted like windows into the openings of the wooden structure of the obelisk. The transparency. So I'm going into a little bit of detail here because, first of all, it's just unbelievable, but also so you have a sense of how this kind of temporary work actually worked. The transparencies were large prints that were made on thin paper and then varnished. They were hand-colored and then varnished with oil and a mixture of oil and turpentine. So they became translucent, a little bit like Wendy Red Star's translucent glass. Candlelight was then installed on the inside, the interior of this wooden obelisk, and shone through the transparencies to turn them into vividly lit screens that made the images flicker and come alive. These illuminated obelisks obviously were terrible fire hazards, but they were also amazing spectacles in a time when there was no electricity or gaslight, no artificial light at all. Paul Revere's illustration shows the 4 different sides of this obelisk. One obelisk, 4 different sides, so you would have to walk around it to get the full story that it told. So go to the blank slide, right? The transparencies for the Columbus monument were even more elaborate than the ones in Boston depicted by Paul Revere. They illustrated what had become at the time a standard narrative of Columbus's life and voyages. The story began on one side with a female allegory of science instructing Columbus and presenting him with a compass. Then the landing of Columbus in 1492, showing a group of American, quote-unquote, American natives in the distance. Then his first triumphant return to Spain in 1493, with Columbus at the Spanish court, seated with Ferdinand and Isabella, and a map of his newly claimed lands spread out at their feet. That was scene number 3. Finally, scene number 4, the last side showed his tragic end in Spain years later, sitting alone in his room. And here the descriptions get really elaborate of this one. So on the wall are the chains that had been used to arrest him and return him, and the words, "the ingratitude of kings." In this last scene, an allegorical figure of liberty stands before him and vindicates his reputation from this mistreatment by the monarchy. She steps on emblems of despotism, and this is my favorite part. She points to the obelisk raised to him by the Tammany Society. So, in other words, the image of their monument actually appears on their monument. So, in addition to these elaborate images, there were also long inscriptions. You can go on each side beneath the transparencies, probably painted on the wood itself. So here are 3 examples. And I want you to note on the right that the Tammany Society at this time also called itself the Columbian Order. So the organization had two very different patron saints, and together they kind of make a study in cognitive dissonance. One was a native chief called Tamenund from the Delaware or Lenape people who had negotiated with William Penn the treaty that created Philadelphia. He was their mascot, in effect. Tammany men at their festivities would often wear bucktails and dress up as Indians. Their other patron saint was Christopher Columbus, who had forcibly taken native land for Spain by the right of conquest. How did the Tammany Society resolve this contradiction? The group was a strong supporter of the French Revolution, which was happening at that very moment, and the revolutionary discourse of the rights of man. And it'll be difficult for you to read it because it's small, but in one of the last images described in the obelisk, the newspaper accounts of the obelisk, was an eagle soaring in the sky, holding a scroll in its talons inscribed the rights of man. And one of the toasts at the event, in fact, was, and I'm quoting here, "May this be the last centenary festival of the Columbian Order that finds a slave on this globe." In other words, looking ahead to the 1892, they were hoping and expecting that slavery would be abolished. And this is particularly ironic given the entanglement of Columbus and his colonizing enterprise in slavery. The Tammany Society was fiercely anti-Catholic, anti-monarchical, anti-aristocratic, and anti-Spanish. So how is it possible for them and the rest of Protestant Anglo-America to adopt Christopher Columbus as their symbol and their inspiration? How did Columbus become a useful legend to reconcile the contradictory ideals of this new white nation? I think exploring these questions can tell us a great deal about the problems we have inherited, especially in regard to the public monuments that continue to occupy our landscape. The Tammany Society's worship of Columbus did not come out of nowhere. Even though Columbus had never once stepped foot in the continental United States, he reached a peak of popularity in the early years of the new nation. Joel Barlow had a smash hit epic poem, a form that is no longer a thing, but was in its day very popular, called The Vision of Columbus, which he published in 1787. That was just 5 years before the celebration and the obelisk I've been talking about. And this epic poem was promoted by luminaries such as George Washington and John Adams. And you can go to the next slide. So the first 3 lines here kind of say it all, kind of tell it all. Long had the sage, the first who dared to brave the unknown dangers of the western wave, who taught mankind where future empires lay. You can go and one for I've highlighted and one more. Highlighted some of the sort of key words that are part of the Columbus myth that were used here in his poem and at the time. These lines in many ways encapsulate what Columbus meant to the new nation. And I'll talk about them a little bit more in just a moment. But for now, I want to point out that to make these lines believable, Columbus had to have a biography that lived up to this hype. A concoction of fact and legend was needed to support Columbus's heroic message. The question of whether Columbus's life actually matched this mythical concoction is an important question, and I'll be referring to it from time to time, but it's not my primary focus tonight. I'm more interested in where the concoction came from, why it proved so useful for the new nation and what its consequences have been. Columbus the man did his own damage to native peoples, especially on the island of Hispaniola. But the myth that grew up around him and that was so actively promoted in the United States in these early years had more widespread consequences. And it is these consequences, the consequences of the myth rather than the man himself, that demand, I think, a full and honest reckoning, which we really haven't had or done. So with that in mind, let me return for a moment to this Joel Barlow's vision of Columbus. At the time he wrote, there wasn't much information about Columbus in the English language. To help his readers, Barlow actually prefaced the poem with a long biographical account of Columbus and his voyages, his royal patronage, his eventual disappointment and death. He patched this together from an earlier biography written in English in 1770, and that biography had been patched together from other texts going back to Columbus's own time, a kind of telephone tag with each version suited to the needs of the present moment. And could go to the blank slide here. But what I want to emphasize here is that Columbus himself started this process with his own self-mythologizing accounts of his first transatlantic voyage written for his Spanish royal audience. It turns out that in addition to his navigation skills, he had considerable PR skills, which helped lay the ground for this future mythology to propagate. One of the major changes he made to his own story was to transform his first voyage to the Indies. That voyage had been conceived by Ferdinand and Isabella in their instructions to him as a purely commercial enterprise. But Columbus, in his own writing, transformed it into a religious conquest. In his official diary and letter about the voyage, Columbus presented it as an extension of what was known then as the Reconquest, the recapture of Christendom from the Muslims and infidels. So before Columbus's voyage in 1492, the Spanish crown had conquered Granada, the last remaining Islamic kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. This victory was followed soon after by a royal order from them, compelling the expulsion of all Jews from the Iberian Peninsula as well. Columbus represented his voyage as the third step in this glorious campaign led by Ferdinand and Isabella to achieve a universal Christian empire. And so when he did conquer territory in the Caribbean, he had Christian crosses placed strategically around the islands, and also the names of Spain's two monarchs hung from trees as physical reminders, we could call them monuments, of Spain's imperial control of the land and the native inhabitants. A year later, after his return to Spain, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull or charter that praised Columbus by name and gave to the Spanish crown the exclusive right to any lands they discovered that were not already inhabited by Christians. So in other words, lands inhabited by Christians, by definition, could not be discovered. Only lands inhabited by non-Christians could be discovered and colonized. Columbus's ambitions for imperial conquest in the name of Christianity became a crucial ingredient of the Columbus story that Anglo-Americans would then use. The second crucial ingredient was Columbus's martyrdom. So we can go and the idea that despite all his efforts to expand this Christian empire, the Spanish court turned against him and, in his own words, made a mockery of me and defamed my enterprise without knowing what advantages and increase of dominion would accrue to their majesties. And he repeated versions of this statement in this story many times. The defamation that Columbus was referring to, among other things, was an investigation of him made by the Spanish viceroy of the Indies in 1500, which documented many serious charges against Columbus, including his plan to enslave the native inhabitants of Hispaniola. And you can actually learn more about this investigation in a very wonderful short video that was made by our hosts here, which I learned a lot from, made with the Spanish legal scholar Pablo Gutierrez Vega from Seville. Columbus then kind of spun this investigation into his activities as a kind of witch hunt against him by his crafty enemies in the Spanish royal court. And in this process of spinning, he laid the groundwork for the narrative of martyrdom to take off. So the biography that emerged from Columbus's own writings and from amplifications and modifications by other authors in Europe had two seemingly incompatible ingredients. One was his ambition for empire, and the other was his grievance against empire. But it was precisely the combination of these two that made Columbus such a perfect figure for the new nation of the United States. On the one hand, the United States was an openly imperial enterprise and referred to the nation as an empire. They routinely used the rhetoric and the tactics of empire to grab native land and to expand the nation's borders westward. On the other hand, the United States promised a new brand of empire, freed from the shackles of monarchy and aristocracy, what Thomas Jefferson called an empire of liberty. That's his phrase, an empire of liberty. This is why Columbus's martyrdom became so important to Anglo-Americans, because it appeared to put Columbus and the United States on the same footing, both having to struggle against European authoritarianism to advance mankind's progress. In the American version, Columbus miraculously changed from a man celebrating the conquest of infidels and the expulsion of Jews into a champion of the American common man. Or in other words, the contradictions of Columbus were the contradictions of America. So I'll take one more slide. So we can see this both in, Barlow's poem of 1787 and in the elaborate obelisk made by the Tammany Society, aka the Columbian Order, in 1792. In both, Columbus and America promise a new order that combines empire with progress, and in both, Columbus and America have to struggle against the tyranny of the old order of Europe. In both, the Columbian Order promises a new dawn for humanity, or more accurately, for some of humanity, because the native peoples who had stewarded their land since time immemorial were definitely not the beneficiaries of this new order. Their own order and way of life were dismissed as worthless savagery or trivialized by the Tammany Society as grist for appropriation and mascots. One way to measure the deep resonance that Columbus had in the new nation is to look at place names. And I realize I'm speaking in a place named after Columbus, so this should not be news to you. But it is actually, when you talk about this with other people, it's actually news to them. But some of this prehistory may even be news to you. The vogue for naming towns after Columbus began in the years around 1790, a little before and after. Among the very first, I would take the next slide. Among the very first was Columbia, Pennsylvania. That's my home state, on the Susquehanna River, about 75 miles west of Philadelphia. It was named in 1788, just a year after Barlow's popular book came out. This was also the year the Constitution was ratified. which set off a competition for where the new federal capital would be located. Columbia, PA, chose the Columbian name to compete for this lucrative prize of becoming the nation's capital. And they almost pulled it off. A resolution was introduced in the Senate to locate the capital there, and it deadlocked in a tie vote, only to be defeated by John Adams, casting the tie-breaking vote against it. Ultimately, of course, the capital city was located in the South instead, between Maryland and Virginia, but was given a similar name, the District of Columbia. The ambitious plan for the capital city, by the Frenchman Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, created a blueprint of the new nation as a westward growing empire. As Columbus rose in significance, there was some discussion about whether his name was more appropriate for the new nation than America. The name America came from the Florentine explorer Amerigo Vespucci, who sank in significance as Columbus rose. As early as 1774, John Adams was arguing that Columbus was a more appropriate name than America. One of the toasts made by the Tammany Society in 1792 was to the, quote, United Columbian States. If you just imagine that as our nation's name. UCS. America did end up, of course, sticking as the nation's name, but Columbus became a ubiquitous place name as the new nation grew westward and absorbed more and more native land. The name spread in already established areas in the eastern states, but also on the nation's western frontier. In some cases, the new Columbia or Columbus was literally on the front lines of native expulsion. We can take one more slide. So, Columbia, South Carolina, one of the very first to be named after Columbus in 1786, was on land ceded by the Cherokees 40 years earlier, but not finally pacified until the close of the Revolutionary War, so not long before it was named. One more. The original Columbus, Tennessee, which actually no longer exists, but the original Columbus, Tennessee, sprang into existence the very year the soil it stood on was taken from the Cherokees in 1819. The town was just a few miles south of the federal Cherokee Agency that was working at the time to remove the Cherokees permanently from the region, an effort that culminated 20 years later in the Trail of Tears. And one more. Columbus, Georgia, was created in 1828 on the western edge of territory that had recently been taken from the Creeks or Muskogees. And Columbus, Georgia became the home base for white land speculators who defrauded the Muskogee landowners remaining in eastern Alabama and stole their land in the late 1820s. It also became the headquarters for General Winfield Scott when he prosecuted the war against the last remaining resistors from the Creek tribe in the 1830s. These are a few examples of a wider phenomenon that I sat down at one point thinking that I was going to do a comprehensive spreadsheet of all the Columbus names and where they were and when they were named. And I realized that task was beyond me. So I'm going to leave that for any future researchers or PhD students, whoever wants to do that. But I think the pattern is fairly clear. The westward spread of towns and cities named after Christopher Columbus literally imprinted on the map of the United States the idea that this new nation was the true successor of Columbus, the true inheritor of his mission. This process of place naming repeated over and over again the doctrine of discovery that Columbus personified. That doctrine, the doctrine of discovery, then migrated into law in a foundational case decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1823, the case of Johnson v. McIntosh. The doctrine of discovery had its origins in the papal bull that I already mentioned in 1493 that gave Columbus and Spain the right to lands they discovered if the lands were not inhabited by Christians. But in 1823, this doctrine was officially enshrined into Anglo-American law in this famous Supreme Court decision. Chief Justice John Marshall, in his opinion, did refer to the 1493 papal bull and validated its fundamental principle that, quote, discovery gave exclusive title to those who made it. Marshall also explicitly reaffirmed the Christian basis of this principle, which the Pope had articulated in his bull. So by this principle, again, only Christian nations could be discoverers and only non-Christians could be discovered. So England could not discover Spain or France because they were already Christian, but England could discover North America because the people who lived there were heathens. And that term heathen was the term that Marshall used in his opinion. This makes no logical sense whatsoever. Why should the act of discovery depend on the religious affiliation of the discoverer or the discovered? Nonsensical as it was, though, this Columbian doctrine gave Marshall the legal weapon he needed to declare that Native people had no ownership right in their own land, even though they had been occupying it long before Columbus or any other Europeans arrived on these shores. The right of ownership went instead to the Europeans who discovered the land and its native people. This self-serving justification for the rights of the invaders rested on the same dubious self-assertion that invaders almost always make, that they are a superior people spreading the benefits of their way of life to the rest of the world. There is perhaps no legal doctrine that has been more damaging to indigenous peoples on this planet than the doctrine of discovery. Marshall and his Supreme Court could have chosen to avoid it and to craft instead some sort of genuine, if limited, native sovereignty, but he decided to follow in the footsteps of Columbus, or the myth of Columbus, and the monarchs of the Old World, paving the way for the near total expulsion of native peoples from their lands east of the Mississippi. The U.S. Supreme Court has never formally repudiated the decision in Johnson v. McIntosh or the doctrine of discovery at its core. Unlike the Vatican, which just last year officially rejected the papal bull of 1493 and the doctrine of discovery and declared that it was no longer Catholic teaching. Here in the United States, Columbus and the doctrine of discovery are still part of our inheritance and still undergird the historical mythology of the United States. And there is no place in the United States where this becomes more apparent than in the National Capitol building in Washington, D.C., the very heart of our democracy. So I'd like to close my remarks tonight by talking briefly about how this happened at the very time that the last of the native tribes east of the Mississippi were being forced off their lands and resettled in the far west. To understand this, we need to jump to the year 1828, when two things happened that would propel Christopher Columbus ever deeper into Anglo-American hearts and minds. 1828 was the year that Washington Irving published his immensely popular and influential biography, The Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, which went into something like 100 editions. Truly phenomenal. It was also the year, 1828, that Andrew Jackson was elected president on a promise, a platform that he would clear off all native tribes east of the Mississippi. Just a few years later, in the 1830s, the U.S. Congress began funding the turbulent process of Indian removal, as well as funding the first large-scale sculptural monuments for its Capitol building. These may seem like two very distinct projects, sculpture in the Capitol and Indian removal, but they weren't. They were interconnected. Congress commissioned 3 high-profile monuments for the Capitol during the Indian removal period. One was a monument to George Washington, one was a monument to Christopher Columbus, and one was a monument to the conquest of the frontier. They took many years to complete. The sculptors were still working on them when the last of the native tribes to be expelled from the east, the Cherokees, were marching and dying on the Trail of Tears in 1839. The sculptures were finally installed on the Capitol grounds in the 1840s, where they framed the main entrance on the east side of the building. The first one to be installed was the monument to George Washington in the public square just in front of the east entrance, where there's a big open space then and now. The sculptor added 2 smaller statuettes on the back of Washington's throne that tied together the themes of discovery, national expansion, and native dispossession. So one more. And on one side, Columbus is seen contemplating the globe, and on the other side, an Indian warrior contemplating his defeat. This pairing of the of Columbus and the defeated Indian warrior was then repeated and greatly amplified in the 2 other monuments, which were placed at the top of the Capitol steps, one on each side. And what you're seeing here is actually a photograph of Abraham Lincoln's inauguration, and these two large are on either side of the steps, sort of framing the entrance. So anybody who entered into the rotunda, congressmen, visitors, lobbyists, went between these 2 huge sculptural groups. On the left side is the Discovery of America, the first full-size sculptural monument to Columbus ever erected in the United States. On the right side, a bizarre scene from the American frontier known as the Rescue. Together, the 2 works frame the nation's conquest of native peoples as a triumph of white civilization, a triumph that proceeded bloodlessly and inevitably without recourse to violence or aggression of any kind. Columbus only has to step onto the continent and raise his globe to cause the native woman to cower beneath him. While the white rescuer, dressed like a Renaissance humanist without any weapon, miraculously restrains the savage Indian with his tomahawk raised, just as he was about to massacre a white woman and baby. In both cases, the native figures crouch or kneel before the white heroes towering above them. They're startled savages who look up in awe at their peaceful and benevolent civilizers. Keep in mind that when these misleading, self-congratulatory monuments were installed in the 1840s, this was the aftermath of a deadly and destructive process of forced native resettlement, when the actual events in that process were still relatively fresh in people's memories. The roundups, the internment camps, the hunting down of fugitives, the suffering of young and old alike on 1,000-mile treks across the United States to a foreign land, the far west, what was then called the Arkansas Territory. All of that history was swept away and replaced by the fiction of benevolence civilizers, starting with Columbus himself. Today, all three of these monuments that I just showed and described, they're all gone from the Capitol. Only the statue of Washington remains on public view inside a museum, the National Museum of American History on the Mall. While the Columbus statue was the first to be erected in the United States, it was also the first to come down. Way back in 1858, partly due to repeated complaints made by Native officials who came to do business there. And of course, they were complaining primarily about the design of that work and the figure of the Native woman. Had it been a more conventional single figure statue without the blatantly demeaning representation of the Native woman, the monument might well be there today. The rest of the Capitol building still remains saturated with heroic imagery of Columbus, however. Even though these have gone, there's much, much more Columbus imagery that still remains up and on view inside the Capitol. Installed in the mid to late 19th century on the rotunda walls, in the dome, in corridors, and on the doors. You can go ahead. These are just a few examples. And as you can see, they kind of trot out some of the same themes, like the Columbus and the Maiden, the landing of Columbus below here, Columbus and the Maiden, which is a kind of painted version of the statue that came down. If there is just one point to take away from my talk this evening, it is that Columbus was already a central figure in the white nation's imagination long before Italian Americans adopted him as their own patron saint. Despite the fact that Columbus was a Catholic agent for the Spanish monarchy who had no connection to the United States, his life story, much of it created through his own self-promotion, provided the building blocks for a potent myth of American empire as the divine instrument of human progress. The Columbian myth of discovery helped justify the relentless expansion of the new nation and the nation's assault on the rights of Native people to their own land and their own way of life. Italian American communities in places like Columbus and Pittsburgh are not to blame for this early American mythification of Columbus, but they were the beneficiaries of this myth. And without it, they never would have built statues to him in the first place. Today, it is not possible to disentangle the Italian-American myth from the earlier Anglo-American myth, because they are like nested Russian dolls in a long sequence of mythification that goes all the way back to the 1490s to Columbus himself and the papal bull glorifying him. I'm only certain of one thing, that the old narratives of discovery and civilization that permeate so much of our public memorial landscape are, to use an overused word, unsustainable. My own belief is that we must start telling a new story if we want to meet the many serious challenges that lay ahead of us. And probably the place to begin with that is to center indigenous peoples rather than their so-called discoverers, to begin to tell their stories and communicate their knowledge, which stewarded life on this planet far longer than the civilizers who came after them. Thanks very much. And